Well, Wednesday, April 14th, will mark 7 years on since the kidnap of 276 girls from government secondary school Chibok by Boko Haram insurgents. The attack sparked the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls, an international campaign embraced by then US First Lady Michelle Obama, and Chibok, a remote, little-known town before the happenings came to represent Nigeria's face of insecurity. 7 years later, there are still many questions left unanswered on the whereabouts of many of the girls remain unknown. Well, here to speak on this is co-author of Untold Story of the Global Search for Nigeria's Schoolgirls is Joe Parkinson. Joe, a very good morning to you. Welcome to the morning show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Well, as I said in the introduction there, it's 7 years on, very soon since their abduction. If we were to ask you about the decision to make this story, what made you choose to tell their story now?
Well, I think this was a story, as you mentioned in your introduction, that not only gripped Nigeria, but really ricocheted across the world. It was a seminal moment in the politics of Nigeria, but it was also a really important moment in the history of social media and the internet. This was the first hashtag anywhere that ignited a military intervention. Now, 7 years later, as you mentioned, the story remains relevant, not just because so many, 112 of the girls, have not yet come home, but because we're again seeing the kind of insecurity in northern Nigeria where school children are becoming targets, and we've seen mass kidnapping in classrooms. So this story is still relevant, but really the two most important parts of this story have not yet been told. The one part is what happened to the girls inside captivity, the girls who were able to win their freedom. How did they survive? And that really is a kind of unbelievable story of bravery, of sisterhood, and survival. And the other story is about the rescue effort, much of which was secret, much of which was classified, and much of which was unsuccessful. So what we've tried to do over the last 7 years, me and my co-author, is try to follow those strains to try and put together this puzzle, which is not just about Chibok, as you say. It's about broader security in Nigeria and really about the way that we across the world interact with conflicts through social media and how that makes a huge change and a huge impact on events.
Well, that brings me to my next question. The hashtag BBOG, a social media campaign, has managed to secure enduring support from individuals, state actors, and non-governmental organizations overseas. But there were also more complicated effects. Now, what does your book say about the power of digital activism today?
It says that it's very powerful. And you raise a really interesting question because Bring Back Our Girls became a global phenomenon. And we can say for sure that without Bring Back Our Girls, the Chibok girls, maybe there wouldn't have been any rescue effort. There certainly wouldn't have been the kind of broad international rescue effort that we saw. And so the brave activists that went onto the streets in Abuja, outside the Hilton, that went onto the streets in Lagos and cities across Nigeria, they really drove change. They were the ones that changed the dynamic and changed the conversation about what was happening in the north. Now, the issue is, longer term, that hashtag was so successful that it also fundamentally changed the dynamics of the conflict in the north. What a lot of security planners, people involved in prosecuting the war in Abuja and in Maiduguri told us during our reporting was that they just could not believe that one single hashtag on a website that many of them didn't use at that point, called Twitter, would so fundamentally change the dynamics of the conflict. And the Chibok girls became what we know as an identifiable victim. So the Chibok girls became the kind of window through which people understood the broader war in Nigeria. The trouble was the insurgency was so much more complicated than just what happened to these girls. And although 276 of these girls were kidnapped, as you know all too well, thousands of people were also being killed. And part of the problem of the international effort was that it was focused too much on that lens and the recovery of the girls, and perhaps not enough on creating a kind of broader remit for trying to end the conflict in the north.
Absolutely, and I can imagine that the effort to make the issue broader would have had to also include some type of synergy between Nigeria and other foreign actors. Your book also refers to the effort of the United States and, unfortunately, seemingly the failure of the United States to bring its intelligence to Nigeria and have that result into more girls being rescued sooner. When you look at those failures, what reasons can you identify for that?
Well, it's a great question, but it's one of the sort of revelations of this reporting and the book is, I think we're all accustomed to an idea of US military power and US intelligence power being almost omniscient. You know, the drones that they have, the capability to listen to people's phone calls and tap into communication. And yet with all of this power, all of the billions of dollars worth of material flying over the Zambesa forest, a part of the world that's not even connected to the internet for the most part, they still couldn't locate these young women. And it's really a story about, you know, the limitations of US military power and military power more generally. Ultimately, the group that found the girls were a small team of Nigerian mediators working with a division of the Swiss government that most people don't even know exists. And so you have this really interesting dichotomy where Bring Back Our Girls was this huge story. It was this global phenomenon. And the US and the British and coalition came sort of running into Nigeria with all of this money and all of this material. They found no one, actually. And then, 3 years later, it was actually a secret effort that virtually nobody knew about, working with the Nigerian government, that got the girls out. And there's a sort of morality tale there, maybe, about the tortoise and the hare, and maybe a morality tale as well, as I said, about the limitations of US and of military power.
All right. While reading the book, I want you to talk about Naomi Adamu. In the book, she seemed to have a defiance and inner strength that is quite striking. You met her and other former captives. Was this the norm?
Well, I think all of the young women that we spoke to had incredible stories of bravery, of faith, and actually of rebellion inside captivity. But Naomi stood out, and that was because she was a kind of arch rebel. She was a very unusual leader, and she was identified by her classmates as a kind of leader in captivity. She was unusual because she really struggled when she was young. She physically had a lot of sickness that kept her out of school for a long time. She was older than the other classmates. They actually called her Mamamu, which in Hausa is our mother, and she had this kind of, sort of maternal affection towards them. But she really started to rebel against Boko Haram almost from the moment that she was captured. She refused secretly to hand over her cell phone when Boko Haram was asking for the girls to hand over their personal effects. She refused to hand over her school uniform and was the only one of the Chibok girls who were released to actually bring her uniform out of captivity. And she also was the only one of the hostages to bring out diaries that she was making with a friend inside the Zambesa forest. It's kind of unbelievable to imagine it, but Boko Haram were giving the captives exercise books to sort of copy out, the sort of strictures of their ideology. And many of the girls were actually using those exercise books to write diaries.
Absolutely. Joe, I'm so sorry to have to interrupt you here. We have to take a very short break, but once we return, we will allow you to continue on your thoughts and continue this great conversation. Please do stay with us. Welcome back to the morning show here on Arise News. We're still joined by Joe Parkinson, who is the bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal in Africa and also the author of the Untold story of the global search for Nigeria's schoolgirls, a story of survival. Joe, thank you for joining us. Before we went on break there, I did interrupt your point. You were talking about Naomi Adamu and how she was very much a memorable captive and how she was, as you put it, more of a rebellious one. In reading up on Naomi, she did say that it got to a point that they had seen so many dead bodies in the forest that they weren't even afraid of dying. Was this synonymous to the mood of the rest of the girls?
I think so. I think, 3 years inside the forest, constantly being moved by Boko Haram from place to place and facing, the threat of starvation, the threat of beatings inside the forest, and the threat of airstrikes and the threat of being killed from above at the same time was something which, of course, is sort of just unimaginable for most of us. And yet, even despite that, we heard these stories of agency throughout. I think most people look at the Chibok girls and sort of, because of the media coverage, perhaps understand they're kind of archetypal victims. And they obviously were victims. They're victims of this awful crime by Boko Haram. But what you learn from talking to them is that they also took their lives into their own hands in captivity. They made choices. They chose to write these diaries. They chose to rebel. They chose not to accept Boko Haram's efforts to force them into marriage. Some of the girls couldn't resist. They didn't have a choice. And some of the girls, just their will was broken. But Naomi and a bunch of her friends were really synonymous with a group that absolutely refused to convert and absolutely refused to accept Boko Haram's creed. And Boko Haram rewarded Naomi especially with a nickname. Her friends called her Mamamu, which is our mother. Boko Haram called her the chief infidel.
Understood. Well, moving on now to international relations, and again, the relationship between Nigeria, the United States, and the United Kingdom as it pertains to rescue efforts. I want to ask you, in your book, you do refer to a time where, U.S. authorities had come over to Abuja, were staying at the Transcorp Hilton, and felt some types of examples of distrust. The fact that their belongings were searched in the room that they were staying in, presumably to the behest, of the Nigerian government. In terms of the dynamics between Nigeria and the other countries, what role do you think that would have played, especially since when it comes to the United Kingdom, it is known that they did have intelligence on the whereabouts of these girls that they did not share. And then even with the United States more recently, the fact that they were able to secure an American hostage in Niger, that seemed to be a successful operation. So why is it when it came to the search for these Nigerian girls, the United States, being the superpower it is, wasn't able to offer lasting intelligence that would have brought these girls, all of them, out sooner?
Well, I think you have to cast your mind back to 2014. And even though the US agreed to provide intelligence and all of this sort of sophisticated drone technology and material to fly over Zambisa, there was a lot of distrust at that point on a security level between the Jonathan administration and the Obama administration. The Jonathan administration felt that the Obama administration had not been supportive enough. They hadn't sold them the weapons they needed to fight the war in the way they wanted to. The Obama administration felt that the Jonathan administration hadn't had allowed the conflict in the north to get out of control. So there was this distrust. And then when all of this sort of sophisticated technology came into Nigeria to help find the girls, that distrust was sort of reflected through that lens. What I mean by that is the Americans didn't want to give the Nigerians all of the intelligence that they had because they didn't trust that they would use it in the way that they wanted them to use it. And they also, by the way, didn't want the Nigerians to see the extent of which what they could actually see. So when they were offering the Nigerians photos, offering the Nigerians readouts of certain kind of intelligence they were seeing over the Zambisa forest, some of it was deliberately degraded. And the Nigerians, as you mentioned, were also very interested in what the American team was doing. These were allies, but they were basically spying on each other. And that was evidence of the distrust. And that was one of the things that fed into this effort, I think. Within 3 months, despite all the fanfare, the American team, the rescue team that had flown into Abuja to get the girls out and then to treat the girls when they were finally released, they were flying home, and it was a quiet failure. Now, on the military rescue and the successful American exfiltration of their hostage in Niger, I think people would say it's maybe not fair to compare the two, just because rescuing 276 or 230 odd hostages, as it was at that time, is a totally different ballgame. A lot of the hostages had been split up, and all of the people involved were very worried that Boko Haram was using them as human shields. So if they launched a rescue effort, and there were efforts to discuss how to do a rescue effort and an exfiltration, they were worried that a lot of the girls, as well as potentially a lot of the rescuers, could be killed by Boko Haram.
You're absolutely right. The Chibok girls were a symbol for a larger problem in the northeast Nigeria. Most families have been touched by Boko Haram. Nobody's immune from it. You have followed the story for quite a while now. In your assessment, what would you say the situation is like? How can you describe the situation in Chibok today? And if you have any details of some of the girls that have been released and what their fate is at this point.
So I think unfortunately the story is still very relevant as we get towards the 7th anniversary. Number one, it's really important that people understand a lot of these young women have never come home. And that's a reason to keep this in the public eye. And a lot of people probably don't understand that Nigeria has the highest number of missing people, according to the Red Cross, on Earth. 23,992 people are missing, have not come home. The majority of them are in the northeast and that are victims of this war. And they're only the people that we know about. So this is still an epidemic problem, the problem of missing. And that's a reason that we still need to talk about it 7 years later. For Chibok itself, I think, this is a community that obviously has been so badly scarred by what happened. Many people have struggled to move on. It didn't get much coverage at the time, but several of the parents of the girls who went missing, they died shortly after their daughters were kidnapped. They'll never see their daughters again. Some of them died of a broken heart, effectively. And so those in the community who haven't managed to get their daughters back will obviously always be living with that pain. There's an additional question now, which is, Chibok has become, in recent months or over the last year, much more of a target again, because the Shekau faction of Boko Haram is somewhat rejuvenated. It's hard to imagine it, but we've spoken to some of the Chibok girls who want freedom, and they have told us that they have had to run for their lives on certain occasions in the villages outside Chibok when they've been attacked again by Boko Haram. So it's a sort of unimaginable thing to perhaps think about. It's possible without, perhaps an upscaling of the government security profile in that region, that some of these girls that were kidnapped in 2004, they could even be kidnapped again. And that has to be prevented at all costs.
Here's the thing, Joe. It does seem as though over time, the kidnapping of the Chibok girls almost has become a precursor to the recent upturn in kidnappings for ransom that we're seeing across the north of Nigeria recently. So when you have that in mind, do you think that with all of these other cases of vulnerable children being kidnapped in northern Nigeria, when we cast our minds back to the Chibok girls, do you think that we're any closer, Nigeria is any closer to bringing all of those Chibok girls back 7 years later?
I wish I could say yes, and I don't actually have insight into what efforts, are taking place, what outreach is taking place between the government and the faction of Boko Haram that holds the girls that are still alive in captivity. I would hope so, but I think those efforts need to be redoubled. Those efforts need to be rejuvenated. And I think, as you mentioned, the fact that this is now becoming a huge problem again, 800 school children kidnapped in the last 4 months. Chibok was unfortunate in the sense that it showed people who are willing to do the most depraved thing we can imagine, which is stealing our children from the places where they should be the safest. What can be achieved by this? What can be achieved is a huge amount of profile and potentially a huge amount of money in ransoms. And this is an emergency, that is not just important for Nigeria, but important for the rest of the world, because you're looking at the possibility of a whole generation of young people across the north of Africa's most important country, Africa's most populous country, not being able to go to school. And what's that going to do? That's only going to increase the seductive kind of capital of these extremist ideas. And so this really is an emergency. The government needs to behave as if it's an emergency. And it's an emergency not just for Nigeria, but for the region and possibly the world.
All right, we'll just go to our final question. Your work chronicled the activities of foreign aids in proffering solutions, most especially in rescuing the Chibok girls. Now, do you have any information on any help that is being rendered in fighting insurgency in the north? And if you can share some of those help that the foreign aids are proffering for Nigeria.
Well, I mean, the American drone effort that started in 2014 is still an intelligence active, is still active. Intelligence action, I should say, is still active across the north. And, the drones are still flying. And in fact, there's far more American troops in the Sahel, the named countries around Lake Chad now than there was when that effort first began. And, there is a lot of international, I think, concern about how this conflict in Nigeria is becoming a real regional problem.
Joe, it looks like we might have lost Joe. I don't know if we're working to get his connection reestablished. That being said, it was an insightful conversation, wasn't it, OG?
It was.
7 years later, it is heartbreaking, yet hopeful that we're, able to have these conversations and identify reasons for why the rescue efforts haven't worked, and hopefully establish ones why, that can explain, hopefully, how we can get to a point where we can rescue the rest of the girls, even though, as Joe says, he wishes he could say, yes, it's a possibility. Yes, we are closer.
Yeah, but like he said, we have to just continue to talk about it, and, hopefully there'll be more solution in helping to rescue and solve the insurgency we're facing in the Northeast.
Absolutely.